Welcome, friends. Welcome back to the kitchen. Welcome back to Sunday morning in the old cookbook show. Today we're going to do a recipe out of this cookbook. And it's just called Cookbook. So it is undated. It is a church cookbook. Undated. It's the Grayling Cookbook, compiled by the ladies of the Mickelson Memorial Church Aid Society, Grayling, Michigan. Undated, as so many of these cookbooks are. But looking at it, there's some things that I can kind of narrow down the time frame. Can't be exact, but I can narrow it down. It's sometime before 1930. The typeface in here sort of indicates that it's before 1930. And the recipe that we're going to do today dates it to sometime after 1920. And as we start mixing this up, I'll tell you why. What we're going to make today is Georgia pecan brownies. So I'm going to start out with 2 egg whites in the copper bowl, and we're going to whip those together. And so I'm researching a different recipe that uses pecans, and I've been really researching the pecan tree, even though I already knew quite a bit about the pecan tree. Julie and I both took forestry in university. And pecan was one of those things that you sort of tangentially looked at because it was one of the last fruit trees, and it is a fruit tree. It is one of the last fruit trees to be domesticated. It proved incredibly difficult to domesticate. And when I say domesticate, I mean make it financially viable to grow them in groves as a commodity with consistent taste and quality. All of those things. And so first off, it is a fruit. It's a drupe. Some other famous drupes that you might know are peaches, plums. Those are drupes. Nutmeg, not a nut. Nutmeg is also a drupe. Okay, so the egg whites are looking pretty good. Now I'm supposed to put in brown sugar and maple flavoring. Went to the grocery. I don't have maple flavoring because why would I buy maple flavoring? And I went to the grocery. This is maple sugar. So I went to the grocery store this morning looking for maple flavoring. I thought, oh, I'll break down and I'll buy some. The grocery store that I normally go to didn't have any. And I know I probably could have driven all over town and found another grocery store that had a bottle of it. But I couldn't be arsed to do that. And I know that I could probably order it from Amazon, but I'm not ordering it from Amazon. So I'm going to do what people in the 1920s and 1930s did. If they couldn't get an ingredient, you find a workaround. Would have been incredibly easy in this time period to get maple sugar. And it would have been really inexpensive as well. So I'm going to put brown sugar and maple sugar. That'll give the maple flavoring. So those go in, and we'll whisk them. That maple smell is absolutely incredible. Okay, so back to pecan. Pecans are native to the United States. They grow in a they natively grow in a very narrow band, north to south, from, Mexico up to somewhere in Illinois, kind of side by side along the Mississippi River. That's the extent of their native growth. Of course, when the Europeans arrived in the 15 and 1600s, they find them and want to start taking them other places. Spanish and the French take them back to Europe, but they're not successful with them at all. They don't grow very well. Amazing. They don't grow very well. There are, historical letters, pecans, and breadcrumbs. There are historical letters showing George Washington and Thomas Jefferson trading nuts back and forth, or the seeds back and forth, so they can grow them on their own plantations. But they never really amount to much. So up until about the 1890s, the only people that were eating pecans were people who happened to have a pecan tree on their land already that was growing there natively, or people whose grandfather had the foresight to maybe plant a couple of pecan trees, but there was no guarantee that those pecans would be any good because of the way pecans grow. And there's this whole genetic thing that I could go on and I could spend 40 minutes talking about it with graphs and charts, and you don't need to hear it. Just just imagine the pecans are incredibly difficult to grow in any great quantity with great flavor until 1847. And as is often the case with these stories, it's the same with vanilla, a slave figures out how to graft the scion of really good pecan trees onto rootstock, so that you're essentially cloning the really good trees over and over and over again by taking a branch off of a tree, putting it onto the roots, and then growing it. This also cuts down the amount of time it takes from planting the tree to bearing fruit. It cuts off like 15 years of growth. That happens around 1846, 1847. Exactly where it happens, there's 5 or 6 different versions of the story. I'm not sure which one to believe, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But that sort of opens the door that eventually, I mean, this information takes a long time, and they're trees that have to grow. About the 1890s, pecans have become a viable commodity crop, and they start moving out to farther and farther places. It's not until about 1920 that this commercial crop really enters the marketplace. So, for someone in northern Michigan or mid-Michigan to have Georgia pecans to do this recipe, it's got to be post-1920. That's kind of the time frame. And it just seems so crazy in 2023 to think, wow, commercially pecans have really only been available to the masses for 100 years. So now I'm supposed to fold the nuts and the very fine dry breadcrumbs into the egg white sugar mixture. And I know there's going to be tons of comments from people talking about how their, great grandfather had a pecan tree. That's great. I mean, that's fantastic. But when I mean about the wider world, people in Minnesota didn't have pecan trees and didn't really have access to pecans until post 1920. I mean, cell phones were effectively invented in 1972 or 73, something like that. But you didn't actually see anybody with a cell phone in their hand until 1984. Usually that was on TV on like Miami Vice. They just weren't common until the 1990s. And this is sort of the same thing. Pecans just weren't common. And in fact, the farther back I go in these books, pre like 1910, you don't really see outside of states where that narrow band of natural pecan trees grew, Texas, for example. In those states, you see recipes that call specifically for pecans, but outside of those states, outside of that natural range, you never see a recipe calling for pecan until kind of post-World War I. So now I'm supposed to place on a buttered baking tin. I'm going to use parchment paper instead of buttering the tin. And I'm going to use this little scoop to make little balls. I don't know how little is little. I know that little really meant little way back then. I'm just going to use this scoop and into the oven. No baking instructions, just until brown. We'll see how that goes.
Hey, Glenn.
Hey, Jules.
Hey, friends. Cookies. Always happy to see cookies.
Georgia pecan brownies.
Oh, I like pecans. Random fact, pecans, not a nut.
They're a drupe.
What else is in that?
Okay. Egg whites, brown sugar. It called for maple flavoring. I used maple sugar. So I cut back on some of the brown sugar and put maple sugar in. And maple sugar really comes through, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's what gives it that kind of caramely, kind of fills it right in. Has a nice look. It needs a cup of tea, but yeah.
The
pretty
breadcrumbs.
sugary.
The breadcrumbs are. I'm on the fence about the breadcrumbs.
I would explain the texture. Sorry.
I like the texture though. I often find there's a breadcrumb flavor that I don't like.
I thought maybe it was oats.
Oats.
You know what I mean? When the texture, I thought maybe you'd just taken some oats and like crushed
Ground
them
up.
up and
Ground up oats instead of the breadcrumbs would be great in this. They are super sweet though.
and once you're down to the end, it's like, whoa, that's one hit of sugar.
That is
Woo!
super sweet. Okay, so these are great. These are absolutely fantastic. I don't know why I've never heard of them before. I've never seen anything like this before. I mean, it is.
That's the joy of getting a bunch of recipe books. There's always something in it. You just,
Yeah.
you flip through it and there it is.
I'm
Ta-da!
so glad that I'm researching pecans, and every pecan recipe has jumped out. That's a winner. Maybe not something that you'd want to give more than half to your 4-year-old. No.
It's a lot of sugar.
Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.
Trying hard not to have another one.